And get the audio going and away we'll go. All right, everyone, we'll get started here. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the October webinar for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. And this is also the start of our 2017-2018 monthly webinar series. I'm Jack Stinsky, and I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon. I apologize if you can't hear me quite too well. My voice is pretty hoarse right now, so hopefully don't lose it here. For those who are joining us maybe for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 15 regional consortia for fire science exchanges across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners and organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before I get started, let's take a few seconds and look at our Adobe Connect webinar interface. To ask a question and interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Once you type your question, make sure you click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. If you would like to learn more about the consortium and what we're doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfireside.net. You can also sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements at the site, and can also follow us on Twitter. Now on to today's webinar, Wildlife Implications Across Snake Treatment Types in Jack Pine Stands of Upper Michigan, Shelby Weiss. Shelby is a recent graduate of the graduate program in Environment and Natural Resources at the Ohio State University, where MS thesis focuses on social and ecological aspects of managing wildlife in fire-dependent forested ecosystems. Excuse me. Prior to that, she received her undergraduate degree from Colorado State University in wildlife biology and worked for the Applied Sciences program at Simi National Wildlife Refuge in Upper Michigan. She is currently employed with the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, Missouri. So with that, let's get to the webinar. Take it away, Shelby.
All right, great. Thank you, Jack, for that introduction. I'm happy to be talking with you all today about some of the work that I did as a part of my master's work at Ohio State University. And so as Jack already said, this project looked at wildlife implications across snag treatment types in jack pine stands of Upper Michigan. Let's see. And so to start, I just want to talk about the role of snags in forest ecosystems. When trees die, their role in the ecosystem isn't over. They release resources like light, moisture, and nutrients, and a variety of organisms, vertebrates and invertebrates, use dead woody material and trees after they've died throughout the entire decay process. So they provide these important structural features for wildlife, nesting, feeding insects that colonize them, as well as microbes and fungi that will continue to be present within the snag and after it's fallen onto the forest floor and continue to decompose. And in the northern Lake States, forests at many locations are different in structure and composition relative to pre-European conditions for a variety of reasons. So things like widespread fire suppression and land use changes have altered many forests, and in some cases reduced complexity and diversity relative to pre-European conditions. And additionally, forest management aimed at timber production is often implicated in simplifying forests and have been criticized in some cases as not always taking into consideration dead woody material. Even forest management specifically directed at creating wildlife habitat doesn't always generate all of the structural features characteristic of natural disturbance regimes. For example, Kirtland's warbler management in creating breeding habitats that The management aims at producing jack pine stands that historically were created through stand replacing fire, but today are primarily produced through clear cutting and artificial regeneration. So there are differences in structural features within the artificially regenerated stands with fewer snags present. And so there's been a lot of awareness in kind of more recent years about the importance of considering dead woody material in forest management. So there's been some research done looking at how might we create snags within forest stands to benefit wildlife. Snags, the original source of snags, of course, is natural disturbance. Things, variety of natural disturbances listed here can all create snags, such as insects, disease, flooding, wind, fire, and then just senescence. There's been a variety of studies, as I said, looking at creating snags in a variety of ways, a whole kind of host of things that people have tried and looked at, including pheromone baiting, fungal inoculation, one of my favorites, dynamite, topping trees, girdling, using herbicide, as well as prescribed fireball, kind of been looked at as potential snag creation treatments to restore forests and potentially benefit wildlife. But as I said, a lot of these studies have taken place in western forests and been more focused outside of the Lake States region. So some work began back in 2003, 2004 at Sweeney National Wildlife Refuge to look at creating snags from live trees through a variety of methods. And so they looked at creating snags through topping, so basically going out and with logging equipment and cutting a tree off at about 3 meters in height, which was the limit of the equipment that was being used. So we couldn't really reach much higher than that. Girdling is the second treatment, and then the third treatment being fire. And girdling was accomplished, again, using logging equipment to scrape the bark off of the middle section of trees. And so the goal of the study was to look at patterns in snag development across a few different species within these 3 treatments, and they went out 4 years post-treatment to look at snag development over time. And the way they evaluated snag development was using decay classification, like basically following this chart here, where you go out and look at a snag and based on the kind of observable characteristics, see whether it falls into really one of these 4 categories. This one here, a 1 would be the tree is still living. And so from this study, they found that there were differences in decay class development among treatments and among species. So really the girdled snags had reached these more advanced decay classes at a faster rate than the other treatments. And so these, important to kind of note, are these decay class 4 and 5 are characterized by having broken. So once the snag is no longer intact, it gets pushed into a 4 or 5. So we see more of these girdled snags reaching these more advanced decay classes quicker. And among the species that they looked at, jack pine had kind of the greatest range in decay classes after 1 year compared with red pine and aspen, so a bit of variability there. And so here's this original study right here. But out of this, it was a kind of a great initial source of information about snags, but there was, they're still out there, so this opportunity to continue asking questions and to see or evaluate wildlife use of the snags, to see who's been using them basically since they were created. And so that's really what the work that I was involved with was where it began. Our objectives were to quantify differences among treatments in terms of specific decay variables, and being a little bit more detailed in what we were looking at and isolating specific decay variables, and then as well as looking at potential differences in use by wildlife, specifically focused on birds and insects. And then our second objective was to look at which of these variables that we'd isolated might best predict the variation that we observe in use. And so when thinking about doing this, we thought about, okay, who uses snags? How are we going to quantify use? Because snags are used by a variety of vertebrate and invertebrate species throughout the decay process, but not everything leaves behind evidence. You'd have to go out and directly observe the snag being used, which we weren't able to do. So we chose to focus on subcortical insects, so those insects that complete a portion of their life cycles beneath bark, as well as primary cavity nesting birds, so species that forage on snags, creating excavations, as well as excavating their cavities. So that's what we decided to evaluate. And so looking at these species groups and what we might expect in terms of their pattern of use, subcortical insects generally colonize dead or dying trees. Often they'll begin colonizing a weakened or unhealthy tree before it's died. And so this colonization with this subcortical insects often proceeds in kind of two waves. So you see this first wave kind of immediately after the tree dies within several years, and abundance declining with time since disturbance as the snag decays more and those nutrients are no longer present that the insects are able to feed on. And so yeah, you see this kind of peak within the first few years, this first wave, and then once the snag falls on the forest floor, that's when you get the second wave of kind of crawling insects and ants and termites and things that utilize the snag once it's on the forest floor and really more kind of dead and down material. And with primary cavity nesters, they're often feeding on subcortical insects during that first wave. So you see foraging activity peak also within pretty early on after the tree has died. And so then as the snag deteriorates, you also see foraging use decline as well. And then as decay progresses and the interior of the wood softens and decays, you see that snags might become more suitable for cavity excavation, especially for some species that are weaker excavators. You might see them using a snag more later on in the decay process. And so here this table lists the primary cavity nesters at Singing National Wildlife Refuge and their relative abundances. And so these are all of the species based on our knowledge of what's present at Singing that we thought were potential excavators of snags. And so you see mostly woodpeckers, but also some songbirds, chickadees, and we have red-breasted nuthatch on there as well. We're focused in mixed pine ecosystems. So you can see that there's a lot of variability in kind of cavity characteristics, a lot of variability, but also a lot of overlap. So that was one thing that we kind of hoped at the beginning, maybe we could figure out which species might have created the excavations that we hope to observe. But there's a lot of variability you can see in these dimensions. And so that didn't end up really being feasible for us to do. So we're speaking more generally just about primary excavator cavity. And so just to give you a bit more background about these snag treatments, the first the prescribed fire treatment was done in 2003. Topping occurred in 2004, and then girdling happened in 2007. So for the topping and girdling, the two mechanical treatments, these were part of a larger effort to restore red pine, reduce heavy fuels, basically reduce jack pine, and prepare sites for a prescribed fire. So these restoration treatments occurred in mixed pine stands that had even-aged jack pine as the most common restoring species, and the goal was to reduce jack pine and promote red pine regeneration. And so they did a variable retention harvest, and so it was kind of a heterogeneous distribution of trees remaining. And so these restoration treatments gave the opportunity while the logger was in there to also create the snags that we studied. So at one location they topped trees, and then at the other location they girdled them. And so trees within these treatments were marked for the logger to then cut or girdle. And then the prescribed fire that occurred in 2003 was of mixed severity, and had a lot of jack pine mortality, over 70% jack pine mortality, with many of the red pine trees still remaining alive after the fire. And so this is just to give you an idea. This is a map of Senior National Wildlife Refuge. It's about 95,000 acres. And so each of these letters indicates where the treatment sites were. So we have girdling treatment here, fire treatment, and then the topped treatment down here. And so within each area, we sampled 35 snags that were all over about 10 centimeters in diameter, and they were all over 2 meters in height. These are just kind of based off of what we'd read about kind of the minimum requirements and recommendations for snag creation treatments for wildlife. And so we measured a variety of different variables. When we first went out in 2004, we were measuring bird activity, so in the form of foraging excavations and cavity excavations. We basically went out to all of the 35 snags in each treatment, so 105 snags total, and looked at all the foraging excavations and measured all the foraging excavations and cavity excavations that we found on those snags. And at the same time measured things like diameter and snag height. And then in 2016, we had the opportunity to come back and collect some additional data, this time looking at insect activity as well as some decay variables. So these actually density too. We looked at number of nearby snags, basically the number of nearby snags or trees within about 20 feet of each snag sampled. But as I said, we were interested in kind of isolating some specific decay variables. And so we looked at wood penetrability, so basically how soft or dense is the wood. And the way we measured that was by taking a pocket knife, and the same person did this every time, but they went out and put a moderate amount of pressure into the bowl of the snag, kind of even pressure, same person each time using the same amount of pressure. And we basically gave each snag a rating 1 through 4 based on how easily penetrable it was. 4 being this situation right here in this photo, where the snag very easily can go all the way through to the interior of the hole. So, and then a 1 being it doesn't really penetrate the outer wood. We also looked at bark coverage, so overall how much bark is left on the snag, bark looseness, how easily removable is that? And that was really a binary variable that we measured at 3 different heights along the tree, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we also looked at past insect activity, and we did this at 3 different locations on the snag. It wasn't feasible to count every single entrance or exit hole or gallery made on the snag, so we did this at 3 different heights, and at each height we counted the number of entrance and exit holes within 20 centimeter, here we go, a 20 centimeter, 20 meter center high band. So within each band we counted number of entrance and exit holes from insects. We weren't really trying to distinguish between the two. And then we also wrapped a clear sheet around that band and counted the number of cells where a gallery intersected. So basically looking at, here's an example of a gallery right here where we would count just the number of cells that particular gallery intersected. And so that's where we got our gallery coverage. And so you can see here what a snag looks like when we were done taking these measurements. Kind of weird looking. And so to analyze these data, we did a couple different things. We used analysis of variance and post-hoc key contrast to compare the treatments, looking for differences in all the variables that I just mentioned. And then following that, we used generalized linear models to predict the abundance of foraging excavations and cavity presence. And then based on our review of the literature, we basically came up with candidate models, lists of candidate models that we thought could be reasonable explanations for foraging observed or cavity presence. And then these models were ranked using AIC. And I'll talk a little bit about that process more later. To start comparing treatments, snag diameter differed among treatments, as did snag height. Prescribed fire-created snags were generally smaller in diameter, which is not entirely surprising considering the snags that would have, more readily perished in the fire. Makes sense that they might be smaller in diameter, and not to mention in the harvest treatments, they were kind of targeting kind of larger, healthier trees. Snag height also differed among treatments. We see that the girdled treatment had the tallest snags, followed by fire, and followed by snag density also differed among treatments, with prescribed fire treatment having snags that were more aggregated than in the mechanical treatments. This is something that kind of, again, was a product of the design, because to go out and do these mechanical treatments, there needed to be kind of enough space to allow equipment to maneuver to create the snag. So that's why you see that difference there. We also see snag penetrability differing among treatments. So top snags were more penetrable or softer than the other treatments, than both other treatments. And we saw that the girdled treatment also had the lowest snag penetrability. So kind of in texture, they were quite hard, and it was difficult to kind of pierce the outside of the bowl of the snag. So interesting differences there. Oh, it looks like my figure has disappeared. That's okay. Oh gosh, that's too bad. I can just kind of speak to it. So we bark coverage and bark looseness differed among treatments. And bark looseness in particular we thought was something important to measure because it can have implications for other taxa that might use it for covers, so species like bats, or even we found snakes and frogs were sometimes sheltering beneath the bark of trees. And so we found differences in this looseness. And so basically looseness, I guess it is a kind of a binary variable where we go up to the section of the tree that we're measuring, and basically anything that can just very easily fall off and be removed by hand we considered loose. And so then we looked at basically percent bark loose, percent bark adhered, and then percent bark not present. And so this lovely figure, I'll make sure when Jack uploads the PDF that we have one where the figure is pictured here. But we found that top snag much higher percentage or proportion of loose bark than both girdled and prescribed fire treatments. Prescribed fire snags had kind of less bark coverage, and then the bark that was kind of left on the prescribed fire snags was more adhered, so it was very difficult to remove from the outside of the tree. It was something that we would had to take kind of a tool to help leverage and remove that bark. Something also, yes. Oh, yes?
Shelby, I'll jump in here quick. Folks, it is on the PDF that I've uploaded. The slide also appears on the PowerPoint I uploaded, so I am baffled as to why it is not the slide you're looking at, Shelby. So I apologize, everyone. But, yeah, the PDF that is uploaded on the website does have this graphic, and hopefully in future webinars we don't have this problem. So apologize, Shelby, but continue on.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, I'll just kind of describe what I'm talking about here, but something to kind of note is with the girdled treatment, and kind of unsurprisingly, as a result of that treatment, there's very little bark present on that midsection of the bowl. So in this figure, you see this kind of it comparing relatively okay with the other treatments, and then this dip at 1.5 meters. Which maybe I didn't mention that before. Each section we sampled the ground level, 0 meters, 1.5 meters, and then finally 3 meters. So I'll move on from this. And so comparing treatments looking at foraging excavations, there were differences in foraging among the 3 treatments, with the prescribed fire created snags having the greatest number of foraging excavations, more than the girdled or topped treatment. There wasn't a significant difference between girdled or topped treatments. And with cavity presence as well, there was not a statistically significant difference. And it might seem surprising, because if you look at the table here, this is just straight number of cavities that we found on the sampled snags. So you see within the prescribed fire treatment there were 11 cavities found, and some of these were present, more than, on some snags there were more than 1 cavity present. So when we did the analysis, it did not end up being reflected because we were treating this as a binary variable. But something to note, certainly. Something else to note was the prescribed fire treatment that I meant to mention before, just because the area that it occurred in was pretty limited. We ended up sampling several red pines as well, and I ran analysis including and excluding them. They didn't appear to really affect anything or behave too differently than the jack pine snags, but that's something to note. Cavities were found, so these 11 cavities were found within 5 snags. 2 of those were red pines. And so then looking at insect activity, this kind of breaks it out by those 3 different heights along the snag. And so you can see, particularly with gallery cover, a lot of use is concentrated lower on the snag, with less use occurring higher up. And then you can this kind of reflects what I was showing with the bark coverage. where very little is happening on the midsection of girdled snags in terms of entrance and exit holes and gallery cover as well. And yeah, so you can see the use at that section is relatively low. And so then looking at a kind of similar graphic for foraging activity, we again see very little activity in the girdled treatment happening at that middle section. By far the most number of foraging excavations are happening in the fire treatment. And then generally we're seeing most of these foraging excavations lower on snags across the board. And so using generalized linear models, we constructed candidate models for foraging and candidate models for cavity presence. So I'll try to walk you through the table here. These are, right here we have, these are predictors for each of the models that we ranked. So, and then here, these are kind of what those predictors represent. So we had models that contained treatment variables. These are just indicator variables for treatment, diameter, stem density, as well as insect activity, and then combinations of these variables. Important to note, for foraging, we didn't include any decay variables as predictors because based on everything we read, most of the foraging likely took place prior to this, prior to when we went out and measured. So any of the observed decay variables we thought was unlikely to have influenced the foraging activities that we observed. We won't see any of those variables included in this list. And so here we have the number of parameters included in the models. We have AIC values as well as delta AIC values. And so this is where the ranking occurs. So if you aren't familiar with how AIC works, it basically looks for models that best explain the data, but it penalizes models that are more complex. So the more complex your model is, even if it does a better job at explaining the variation, the score will reflect, it'll be penalized, those more complex models. And so applying AIC, this delta AIC tells you which is the highest model. And so the 0 is going to be your highest ranked model with the lowest AIC value right here. And then we have our weighted AIC, which basically gives you an idea of how likely this model is. And so our top two models are both pretty close to one another. We have a model including just the treatment variable, and then a model including treatment plus number of insect holes. And so when you, yes, that, the number of foraging excavations. And in the second model, we again see similar results in terms of treatment, but holes, insect holes, didn't end up being a variable that was significantly predicting foraging activity. So it ended up in the second most ranked model. So basically we see here that nearly 2 times the number of foraging excavations were predicted for a snag that was in the fire treatment, and 1.4 times as many predicted in the prescribed fire treatment compared to the tox treatment. Ooh, sorry for the quality here. So for cavity presence, we were able to include some more predictor variables because we theorized that decay is probably something that would influence cavity use. So we included those decay variables right here: integrity, penetrability, and bark cover. And we see that our highest ranked model is snag diameter, followed closely by treatment plus nearby snags, so essentially snag density. And so when we run these models, let's see here, we find that diameter is a significant predictor of cavity presence, with the odds of a cavity being present 1.14 times more likely for every centimeter increase in diameter. And this is something that supports other studies as well, that looking at what factors into nest trees. Diameter is often shown to be an important predictor of that. Treatment, again, was a significant predictor of cavity presence. So cavities were 9 times more likely to be present in a snag within the prescribed fire treatment. And nearby snags, or snag density, was also a significant predictor, kind of basically seeing that cavities were less likely to be present when there were more nearby snags. And so, in summary, looking at how these treatments each break out in terms of their major snag characteristics. I apologize, it looks like something kind of wonky happens here with the table, but I'll walk you through it. So basically, we saw that girdled snags had lower bark retention, particularly at the site where it was girdled. You have a nice picture here of kind of what that girdling looked like, and on this middle section of the tree. And these snags were also harder, less penetrable, and they were also prone to breaking. If you'll recall from the original study, girdled snags were found to break sooner. So by the time we came out and measured everything, things have kind of equalized, and a lot of snags across treatments had broken. But it seems that girdled snags may break sooner. The topped treatment had higher bark retention, and everything's kind of just scooted down. The top treatment actually had the highest level of colonization by subcortical insects in greater proportions of loose bark, as well as being the softest, and the wood was less dense. And then finally, prescribed fire, fairly low bark retention, not the most heavily colonized by subcortical insects. I'm sorry, everything is scooted down. But in the prescribed fire treatment, oh, thanks, Jack. Yeah, I think Jack is saying in the chat box that he's linked to the PDF. So if you want a kind of better, more easily interpretable slide, I think he's directing you there.
Yes, yeah, I'll jump in here. Yes, again, I looked at this slide, and when we uploaded it, it was fine. I did have to re-upload it, so I don't know if there's some conversion problem there. So I apologize. Yeah. You can look at the corrected slide in the PDF. So continue, okay. Shelby. I apologize.
No, thanks, Jack. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, just finishing up with this slide, prescribed fire, we see greater adherence of the remaining bark left on the prescribed fire snags. Wood hardness is actually comparable to live trees. This is something I didn't include, but we did go out and look at some of these variables on live trees as well, just to make sure we weren't missing anything. And so, interestingly, prescribed fire wood hardness is actually pretty similar to that of the live trees. And so some conclusions here. Treatment with the highest level of insect use, basically the top treatment, didn't have the most foraged on snags. This is I thought was kind of counterintuitive to what I would have expected. And we also see that treatment was an important predictor of both foraging, excavations, and cavity presence. So perhaps what this is telling us is that birds are selecting snags to forage on and for cavities based on additional cues, particularly for foraging cues, kind of environmental cues, perhaps recently burned stags at Sini, we do get black-backed woodpeckers that show up after there's been a fire in pretty high numbers. The black-backed woodpeckers generally are very eruptive in nature. They'll kind of move into a stand pretty soon after a fire occurs. So it's possible that a lot of the foraging excavations we observed in the fire treatment can be attributed to black-backed woodpeckers. Certainly possible. And then it's also acknowledging that when you have a treatment, we say treatment variable is predicting these things. Treatment is something that's encompassing a variety of variables. So also maybe not surprising that that's doing a good job of predicting these things. It represents kind of an amalgamation of characteristics. Large diameter snags, important for cavity excavation, something that we see supported throughout the literature. And thinking about top snags, something that we gave some thought to was, could height be a limiting factor as to why we didn't get greater numbers of cavities within the topped treatment? We're limited in 3 meters for that treatment just based on the equipment that we were using. So it would be interesting in the future to kind of explore topping at different heights to see if you get greater levels of use by using a different method. And that was something too. Height wasn't included in any of our models for that reason, since the top snags were all basically 3 meters in height. When you included it in the models, it just basically acted like another treatment variable. So yeah, something to consider for future study would be looking at maybe topping snags at a higher level. And so this was, oh look good, this one showed up pretty well. We wanted to think about all of these characteristics that we'd measured on snags and see major snag characteristics, and then see perhaps think about what implications these have for other taxa apart from cavity nesting birds. So we have this table here where we look at the potential kind of utility of each of these treatments for other taxa. So the girdled treatment having that low amount of bark retention and could maybe perhaps wouldn't provide that cover for the species that might rest beneath bark. But given that it breaks earlier on and maybe is a little bit more desiccated because of the bark being removed, we think that this treatment may yield long-lasting coarse wood material that could be beneficial to small mammals as well as herpetofauna, just as cover. And we see the top treatment, as I said before, high use by insects and higher wood softness. So potentially a substrate that could be easily excavated by cavity nesters, though height might be limiting, at least in our study. But looking at implications for mammals and herpetofauna, because it has such a high proportion of loose bark, we think this treatment could be of high value for mammals like bats. And then we actually found, as I mentioned when we were on that slide, we found quite a few snakes, and we found a tree frog resting beneath the bark within this treatment, which was kind of cool and something I didn't necessarily expect to find when we were out there. And then finally, prescribed fire treatment appears to be the favorite of the birds that we were measuring excavations for. Had low bark retention, again, greater adherence of remaining bark, so perhaps not capturing that function of cover beneath bark, but still a lot of subcortical insects present. And perhaps over time, as it continues to decay, continuing to provide cover for bats and small mammals as well as herpetofauna. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge Ohio State University, Sweeney National Wildlife Refuge, Sweeney Natural History Association for their support with this research. Sweeney Natural History Association in particular was great in giving us support through these wonderful interns who helped collect this data. Sarah Rademacher, Lindsay Morrison, and Taylor Gosselin were all a huge help in doing this project. And with that, I can answer some questions from folks if they have them.
Yeah, so a reminder, everybody, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. We'll wait a few minutes here, Shelby, to see what questions we have coming in.
Okay, great.
The question I have for you, you talked about the prescribed fire that created the snags. Do you know if it was a dormant season or growing season burn?
Oh, goodness. I actually don't know if I know that question, the answer to that question. Is Greg in the audience?
Yes, Greg.
And
it's just
maybe,
more
yeah, he's going to type in. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the questions, not to expect to have the answer, it was a growing season.
He says growing season. Yeah, flames coming out of jack pine 45 feet in the air. Yeah, I wasn't at Sweeney at that time, so thank you, Greg, for answering that question.
Yes, yeah. And I was just kind of curious as, there's a more recent discussion about different types of season of fire and how that even may have potentially provided different snags.
Yeah.
I don't know that for sure, but.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. And perhaps that factored into why the bark might have been so well adhered to the tree. It's a higher severity fire. I think you might see differences there in terms of your decay variables.
Correct. We're not seeing any more questions coming in yet. Give people a few more minutes here to ask some questions. Just to remind you that this is being recorded, so there'll be a link to the recording put up on the web page. I intend to get that up this afternoon. I'll also get it transferred into YouTube video, so if people cannot access the Adobe Connect recording for whatever reason, we do have another backup recording to YouTube. And I also took a link here to the PDF. I apologize to Shelby and to all for the couple slides that did not upload correctly. I don't know why that is, because the PowerPoint you sent me, I looked at and the slides are perfect. So we'll investigate, so hopefully we don't have that same issue for future webinars. And thanks, Shelby, for being the guinea pig, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
See what's going on here with that.
Right. Well, it looks like we have a couple more messages here. Maggie asks, any opportunities to compare with wildfire-created snags? I think that would be really cool, and I hope that, I think that would be a really cool project. Actually at Sweeney, and I don't want to offer Greg up for this, but there's, I know there's snags in some, well, no, there aren't any wildfire. Hold on. Scratch that. But nothing that I'm directly involved with, but I do think that, it would be really cool to look at wildfire-created snags. And then Greg just had a message, just an FYI for all land managers, treatment costs, girdling and toppling were zero, and the loggers enjoyed it to some degree. Yeah, great point. I mean, this was an opportunistic study, certainly, so it's nice that they were able to include snag creation along with those restoration treatments.
Yeah, so as part of the treatment, if you can write that into the contract loggers with the equipment on site, it's nice to know that, it's pretty minimal cost or no cost. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. Let's give it just another minute to see if anybody has any.
Sure.
Otherwise, we can wrap it up. I know, I believe you have another slide here that has. Yeah,
so if anyone thinks of a question later and wants to contact me, they are welcome to do so. We also will be having a publication come out soon in forest ecology and management. And so, yeah, hoping that that's going to be posted online any day or week now. So there's the reference for that.
Okay, and once that's actually out of press, basically available, we can get that link up onto this web page and likely highlight it in our newsletters too, so it kind of connects with the webinar to the publication.
Yeah, great. That would be awesome.
All righty. Well, I guess we will go ahead and wrap it up. Not too many more questions coming in. I'll go to the next slide here. So I would definitely like to thank you, Shelby, for taking the time to do the webinar. And again, apologize for the few little technical glitches we had, but everything went smooth with that. Obviously, thank everybody else for joining us online this afternoon for the questions. Again, if you'd like to review this webinar or the PDF, those recordings will be up on the website shortly, and the PDF is ready up on this web page. And this web page stays archived, so you can always access it. You have Shelby's contact information, and that is also up on the web page. So if you have any future questions, you can relay it directly to her. Our November webinar is going to take place November 16th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. It's going to be on Can Fire, Predicting Fire Behavior and Fire Effects by Dr. Bill DeGroot. He's a fire research scientist, Natural Resources Canada, Canadian Forest Service. It's actually going to be kind of a joint webinar between our North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange and also our Alaska Fire Science Exchange. So a number of different exchanges that have a lot of interest in the Canadian models and the behavior predictions and fire effects that they're seeing. So with that, again, I'd like to thank Shelby and online. Shelby, any last thoughts or words?
No, thank you all for tuning in and listening. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Jack.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody. We will hopefully see you in November. Thanks, Shelby. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.